to another interesting class. This week's topic is on Ife and Benin art culture. We are going to look at the different techniques of producing these artworks. We are going to focus on the lost wax bronze casting, the carving of elephant tugs and wood carvings, and we are going to concentrate more on the different marks that are produced in Benin. And again, we are going to concentrate more on the reasons why the Benin art and the Ife art culture is referred to as art for life, and how the environment were able to influence these art pieces, and how the urbans were able to instruct the craftsmen on what and how to produce these art pieces. And again, we are going to look at how the immediate environment influences the production of these art pieces. Let's join me as we meet in this. Stay tuned as we pay attention to detailed information.
Art in Africa, like music and like traditional religion, is an essential tool to help us understand the history of the continent. From rock paintings to wood sculptures, from terracotta pots to bronze masks, all give us a unique insight into the past.
These works were not made as art for art's sake as they are in the West. They're really art made for life's sake. They played a very important role in the lives of the people who made them. They were not meant for museums. They were handled, they were fondled, they were part of the entire society.
Artwork records many of the great events in Africa: foreign invasions, royal ceremonies, religious worship. But art also gives us a window into the small domestic details of day-to-day life.
The Story of Africa, History from an African Perspective. Part 12, The Art of Ife and Benin, presented by Hugh Kwashi.
For a few weeks in 1910, Frobenius carried out excavations and unearthed many terracotta and stone heads. But he was also shown a brass head, which he was told was Olokun, the Yoruba god of the sea. He photographed it for his book, The Voice of Africa. It bears a striking resemblance to the head of Ife in the British Museum.
He thought it was of Greek or ancient European origin. He identified it with Poseidon, with the god of the sea. He identified the kingdom of Ife with the lost kingdom of Atlantis. And he wrote all of this up, and indeed it was published in the Illustrated London News over there in 1910. What happened in order to disprove all of this was over there where those people are two small brasses excavated in 1939 by Thurston Shaw, Igbo Ukwe brasses. One is of an elephant head, and those are about 1,000 years old. And they proved that this was an autonomous African tradition.
Finds expression in such diverse activities as weaving, basketry, beadwork and jewelry. But it is in sculpture that the continent is often viewed as having excelled. And it is from Nigeria that
1620 shows the King of Benin riding out to receive the plaudits of his people.
The first Portuguese visitors had brought back many stories of the Oba's military might, and thought him so powerful that they took back an ambassador to Lisbon to be received by the King of Portugal. The Oba was a human god, so sacred that no commoner could look in his face. On the few occasions he left his palace, he was preceded by musicians and leopards, the symbols of his power. He owned dwarfs, just as European kings did at that time.
Their own styles and techniques, styles that were entirely African in inspiration and execution. They have their place today among the artistic masterpieces of the world. This ivory armlet places the king where he belonged in Benin society, at the center of all things. From Holland to the King of Benin, in about 1600, wrote this report.
The city is composed of 30 main streets, very straight and wide. The houses are arranged in good order. The people are in no way inferior to the Dutch in cleanliness. Their houses are as polished as a looking glass. They have good laws and efficient police and show us 1,000 marks of friendship.
The Oba, king of men, could handle leopards, the kings of the forest, like toys. From his waist sprang mudfish, symbols of power over sea and river, whose guardian was Olokun, archangel of the waters. The king had great authority, but this depended on the support of noblemen and appointed chiefs, and on certain persons of ritual power. Among these were the queen mothers of Benin, one of whom is shown in this memorable head, sculpted in about 1550. Adjoining Benin was the ancient empire of the Yoruba people, with its heart in the city of Oyo. The Yoruba developed great military strength based on cavalry.
Production of art in Benin, capital of the Edo Kingdom, appears to have started around the 15th century, although it's been suggested that the kingdom, and possibly its art, was in fact much older. Most of the work is in bronze, though ivory, terracotta and wood were also used. The sculptures are often termed court art, commissioned by and produced for the Obas or kings. Throughout its history, the African continent has produced distinctive art forms. From the rock art of the San of the Kalahari and the Saharan Berbers, the throwing knives of the Congo, the wooden stools of the Ashanti, the masks of the Dogon. Hugely diverse and highly sophisticated art forms which have evolved over thousands of years. Just as the griots of Mali preserve their history through oral rendition, so too does art take on the vital function of communication within societies which do not rely on the written word. The Oba was responsible for maintaining the guilds of bronzesmiths, woodcarvers and beadworkers. He commissioned the artwork, which is for the glorification of the kings and the veneration of royal ancestors. The Benin craftsmen did not limit themselves to sculpting busts and faces. They also designed intricate plaques, which recorded the day-to-day activities of the court and kingdom.
Many of the stories of Africa are told here, the British Museum in London. This is where thousands of artifacts, collected, bought, and taken from the continent, ended up. When they were first discovered, objects from the ancient kingdoms of West Africa stunned the world. None more so than these extraordinary plaques. They came from what was once the Kingdom of Benin, and are around 500 years old. When the British came upon these objects in 1897, they thought there's no way they could have been created by Africans. They were amazed at the detail and the intricacy. They were seen as being something completely revolutionary to the British, and you can understand why. These aren't carvings. They're 16th century casts in copper-rich alloys of brass and bronze. Over 900 plaques are thought to have been made. To produce each one, the artist would need to know how to make and fire a clay mold, and how to melt the metals to pour into it. It's an incredibly difficult skill to master. The combination of relatively sophisticated science and artistic accomplishment baffled most European 19th century observers. They couldn't believe that so-called primitives had been capable of producing work of the same standard as their European contemporaries. These amazing objects just didn't match the Europeans' view of West Africans.
Those 3 African traders. They're holding manillas, the currency that was used for trade with Europe. The next plaque along shows their Portuguese trading partners, and they're not short of a manila or 2. This salt cellar is presented as an object to be admired, not just explained. It's been given an aesthetic value that reaches beyond its historical context. This leopard can be seen as a piece of art, but originally it was used for carrying water. Seeing it purely as a sculpture could strip it of its meaning within the culture where it was created.
Many French still assume that they have this vision of African cultures as essentially tribal, relatively unhierarchical, relatively without...
These bronze pieces, and some 2,000 others like them, arrived in Europe in 1897, and they created a sensation. For they were so accomplished and so unlike the wooden masks and fetishes that explorers had brought back from Africa before them, that many people said that they could not be purely African in origin. And today, the treasure of Benin is dispersed among museums and collections all over the world, in Britain and America, Germany, Russia, Switzerland, Sweden, France, and Australia. The second biggest collection is now back in Nigeria, but none of the objects have returned to the place from which they were taken, the palace of the Oba of Benin. The plaques, about 1,000 of them, were found by the punitive expedition stacked in a storeroom. Apparently they had been taken down some 200 years before. Once they had covered the pillars of the palace, and together they give a detailed picture of the Benin court at the height of its glory and power. Occasions that the Oba left his palace, his sacred body had to be protected from the rays of the sun by the shields of his chiefs. His attendants, going before him, carry leather caskets containing kola nuts for the Oba to distribute as a gesture of patronage. Until the end of the 16th century, metal was in such short supply that the craftsmen were extremely sparing with it. The bronze of the earliest pieces is of eggshell thinness, and the delicacy with which the original wax was modelled and covered in clay was so great that little filing was necessary. So the disciplines imposed by a scarcity of metal contributed to the development of a style which surely represents one of the high watermarks of sculptural inspiration in all Africa.
Commissioned by the king, now lie in Benin City Museum. These are, sadly, mostly replicas of bronzes that were taken from here in 1897. But even so, I'm struck once again by the intricacy of these objects. It's always the detail that shocks me when I look at these Benin plaques. I mean, the whole thing is very much like a historical document as much as a piece of art. I mean, this is depicting very particular people, and you can imagine them in all of their finery, because you can see it actually depicted here, the detail of the textiles, the layered textiles that they're wearing. Many bronzes depict 16th century obas, and they are records of specific events, such as military victories which expanded the kingdom. This, for me, will be Oba Essegie returning from fighting the Agala triumphant with his retinue. Oba Essegie bolstered the kingdom with the help of the Portuguese, who provided weapons and mercenaries for battles. Many of the plaques were made during his reign. The Portuguese also brought the metal, which enabled the bronze casters to immortalize his exploits. But this craft predates the arrival of the Portuguese, so there must have been another source of copper for the bronzesmiths.
When this plaque was made, the Portuguese had been in touch with the kingdom for something like a century, and they too appear on the plaques. They're shown with such accuracy that it's possible to date them from the details of their clothing. This man must have been in Benin in the early 16th century. He's armed with an elegant sword, but the Portuguese had more advanced and effective weapons than that. They brought cannons and muskets, the first guns that the Bini had seen, and they had crossbows. The Oba persuaded them to join his army, and with them on his side he became one of the most powerful rulers in West Africa, conquering an empire that stretched for 200 miles along the coast from the frontier of present-day Dahomey to the banks of the Niger River. The Portuguese were seeking ivory, pepper, and above all, slaves. The Oba supplied them, and in exchange obtained metal. One of the attendants waiting on this chief carries what was to become the standard currency on the coast, a European-made ingot of bronze, a manila.
It was at the end of the 19th century that Europeans first began to take a serious interest in the art of Africa. In 1897, over 2,000 works of art were removed from Benin City in Nigeria after the city was destroyed by British troops. The Benin bronzes stunned Europeans who saw them.
People worried long and hard about the Benin bronzes. Could they really have been made by Africans? Were they actually made by Portuguese for them? We now know, of course, that they were made by Africans, and that casting tradition stretches back long, long before European influence. But at the time, they changed, very importantly, our preconceptions about what African art was and what Africans were like.
But the people who made these majestic sculptures, dating from the 16th to the 19th century, were relative newcomers in the art and craft of casting metal. Their oral traditions told them that they had learned their skills from the Yoruba people of Ife, about a
and attempting to understand its social and cultural context. African art simply did not fit into the rigid and formal categories that dominated Western art theory. Yet, ironically, it was the profound values of African art which brought about a major change in a group of European artists at the beginning of the 20th century. Dr. Pogoson.
The artists were revolting at that time. They wanted to break away from the strict traditions of naturalism. The camera had come, and so they couldn't compete with it because it would give you direct images. And so there was a revolt among artists. They wanted to move on. And so people like Picasso started to break down human forms from what they were in the past, natural, into cubes. And that's how Cubism started. And so it's a motivation from the African wood sculptures.
In 1907, the Spanish painter Pablo Picasso visited the Ethnographic Museum at the Palais du Trocadero in Paris, where he underwent a transforming experience.
When I went to the old Trocadero, it was disgusting. The smell. I was alone. I wanted to get away, but I didn't leave. I stayed. I understood that it was very important. Something was happening to me, right? The masks weren't just like any other pieces of sculpture. Not at all. They were magic things. I understood what the Negroes used their sculptures for. They were weapons, to help people avoid coming under the influence of spirits again, to help them become independent.
Picasso described African art as a form of magic, a mediator between the strange, hostile world and us. One significance of this recognition was that artifacts from the continent were no longer to be judged in the court of Western art. They could continue to speak for themselves, as they had spoken to Africans for generations.
In the 19th century, the British saw the kingdom as an opportunity to extend their influence in Africa. They established a trade agreement, but when Benin reneged on it, relations deteriorated. A British delegation ignored warnings not to approach the Oba and were massacred, leaving just 2 survivors from over 200 people. A month later, in February 1897, 1,200 British soldiers arrived in response. The city walls didn't stop the British punitive expedition, and the city was razed to the ground. At the Royal Palace, they found artwork that they couldn't believe had been created by Africans. Around 2,000 pieces were taken, sold, and distributed to Western museums. The Oba was deposed and died in exile. It was a catastrophic defeat for the Kingdom of Benin.
In January 1897, the vice-consul of a British trading settlement on the coast decided to visit the Oba. The Oba had recently accepted a trading agreement with the British, but he wasn't keeping it. No palm nuts or palm oil were coming out of his territory, so the Oba had to be reprimanded. The traditional way to reach the city was to travel up the mangrove-lined creeks of the Niger Delta to the village of Ugoton, which marked the frontier with the Benin Kingdom. Messengers had been sent ahead by canoes with gifts to tell the Oba that the British vice-consul proposed to visit him. But as they travelled upriver, they met messengers on their way back with a reply. The Oba did not wish to see the British at this particular time. The party reached Ugoton on the afternoon of January the 3rd. On the way up, they had been collecting carriers, and now they had the 240 men that they needed to carry all their supplies. But here there were more messages from the Oba telling them not to come. The local people gave them vehement warnings. It would be very unwise to go to Benin now, they said, for the Oba was celebrating Igwe. Igwe was and is the most important of all Benin rituals. It was last held in 1964 when these pictures were taken. During it, the Oba salutes the shrines of the earlier god kings, his ancestors, and renews his divine power. In 1897, as in previous years, the climax of Igwe was to be the sacrifice of a man. It may be that the Oba was trying to prevent the British vice-consul from seeing these grisly rites. At any rate, his messengers did their best to persuade the British to delay, if only by a few days. But Vice-Consul Phillips was not to be put off, and with his British companions and 240 carriers, he left Ugoton at 7 o'clock on the morning of the next day, January the 4th. This is the path they took. It is so thin and narrow that they had to march in single file. Europeans and Africans were slaughtered indiscriminately. Only 2 Europeans escaped. The Benin warriors hunted them through these thick forests and came within yards of them several times. They had nothing to eat, and the only thing to drink was the dew from the leaves. One of them was badly wounded, but after 5 days they reached the river. The wounded man's arm had already turned gangrenous. Both their bodies were black with thorns. The news of the massacre had gone ahead of them, and on January the 11th, only